for today are to describe the distribution of water in the body, define the various fluid compartments. We'll talk about what separates those compartments and what is entailed in each. And then we'll look at homeostasis, and we'll talk about some of the examples of homeostasis that are really important for our daily functioning, but also just our existence, right? Homeostasis is really important for just keeping us alive, okay? So we'll hit the first objective first. And we'll do that by starting to think about the organization of the body. So this is a really good schematic to start with. It's a representation of what the body looks like. It's a minimalist version of that, in that there aren't exact sizes or proportions, right? This doesn't in any way look like our body, but it's an accurate representation of the way our body is compartmentalized. So we have an external environment, and then we have an internal environment. Right, so this is our external environment. This is everything that's around us. Think about oxygen, think about the air that's around us, our physical environment, versus our internal environment. What do you think this barrier represents? Anyone? So right around here, what does this represent? So what's separating the external environment from our internal environment? Perfect, yeah, so skin. So this is going to represent our skin, the epithelial cells that make up our skin, and that's going to be really important for separating what's happening inside our body from whatever's happening outside. So that can be temperature, that can be pH, that can be water content, that can be oxygen content. It's really important that our internal environment has its own regulatory processes that can be separated from what's happening around us. This is what allows us to warm ourselves if it's cold outside. We have, internal mechanisms to help with that. And so that's another important part of the presence of skin to separate these two environments. If we look more closely within the internal environment, we have other compartments as well. So we have blood vessels, right, which are containing blood. And blood is a really important part of how we can exchange nutrients as well as exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide. So notice at the top here, this area is representing the lungs. And so we're exchanging these gases across the alveoli of the lungs into the bloodstream. Okay, that's how we can get rid of CO2, breathe it off, and then exchange oxygen and circulate that to our tissues. Also notice that we've got cells. So these will make up our internal body structures and organs like muscle and bones and nerves, okay? And there's also exchange happening between our blood and these internal structures. Again, this is how we can absorb oxygen and make use of that to make ATP, or again, exchange waste, things that the body no longer needs, byproducts from metabolic processes. Those can be released and circulated to the lungs to be eliminated as well. Also think about two other important body systems that are represented here. One is the gastrointestinal system. And here we can see that there's also exchange happening across the internal lumen of the GI tract. So we have nutrients coming in, water coming in, ions coming in, minerals and vitamins. This is coming in from all the food that we eat. And then it's going to be broken down and absorbed, and those nutrients can be transferred into the blood and then circulated to all of our, over here, organs and internal tissues, right? Lastly is the urinary system. So the urinary system is also playing a part as well. We've got the exchange of waste that is picked up from our body tissues that can be filtered, and then urine is created, and then that can be eliminated. Also through the GI tract, we can eliminate solid waste from the food that we eat as well. So notice how we're seeing an interplay between all of the internal body compartments and some aspects of the external environment as well. So via the GI tract, via the urinary tract, via the respiratory tract. So these are areas where there's interplay between our external and internal environment. The other thing that's interesting to point out is even though these structures are inside the body, so the GI tract is inside the body, it's still an example of the external environment because things that we introduce into the oral cavity that make their way into the GI tract are still present in the external environment until they actually are moved across this epithelia and are absorbed into our blood and then subsequently into our tissues. Okay. All right, let's describe each of these environments in a little bit more detail and what they include. So the internal environment, we said, is the immediate environment of our cells. It's everything that's really inside our body, excepting things like our respiratory tract, which is still considered external, urinary tract, and the GI tract. It's going to include fluid and plasma. So fluid is going to be all of the water that's in our body, all of the extracellular fluid that has ions in it. And then plasma is going to be specifically what's in the blood. So plasma is what's left behind if you take the red blood cells out of blood. It's the watery part of the blood. And so to further break that down, we have tissue fluid, that's fluid that is around our cells. So there's fluid here around our cells and tissues versus, again, the fluid that is inside our vessels and is a part of our blood. The external environment is going to be everything external to the epithelial barrier. It's going to be everything outside of our skin, the air around us, the air in our lungs, the food in our gut, we said, is also in the external environment, the urine in the bladder, the urine that happens to be in the urinary tract. All of this is still an example of the external environment because it's not really inside our blood vessel or inside our cells or our body tissues. Let's talk about why there has to be exchange or why there has to be movement between these two compartments, right? So it would be tempting to think that the external environment should maintain its own barrier and the internal environment should be separated. But even though there is separation, there still needs to be exchange. There still needs to be an opportunity for things to get across the membrane. So the reason for that is for the absorption of nutrients and oxygen and then the elimination of waste. So this is why we have movement across the epithelia in the lungs, movement across the blood vessels and into our tissues back and forth, and then movement across our urinary tract in the kidneys, and our blood, and then movement happening across the GI tract as well. Notice again here, the trend is that movement is happening in both directions. It's semi-permeable movement, so everything is not moving through, right? Blood cells are not leaving the blood vessels. The nutrients are the ones that are leaving the blood vessels. The fluid is leaving the blood vessels to make urine. So this is going to be a semi-permeable example of exchange where some things will get across and others will not. And this is really important for maintaining our survival, keeping our body nourished, and eliminating waste. All right, as we talk about the locations here, I think we already described some of the examples of these organs, the lungs, the GI tract, the kidneys being some of the most common ones. And so if we look at the exact mechanisms of how this exchange is happening, these can be described as distinct processes. So across the GI tract, absorption is the movement of substances, specifically biomolecules from the GI tract into our blood. This is how we absorb carbohydrates, how we absorb fats, how we absorb proteins. That's going to be by the process of absorption. Secretion, on the other hand, is movement of things from the blood vessels or tissues out into the GI tract. This is how we secrete enzymes that help to break down the food in the tract. This is how we secrete acid. Hydrochloric acid is really important to break down, again, that food into smaller parts. This is also how we secrete mucus. And mucus is really important because it helps to lubricate the GI tract and help things to move along smoothly. So there's movement happening in both directions. Absorption is the GI tract into the blood, and then secretion is the blood out into the GI tract. If we think about what's happening across the kidneys, similar types of processes, but again, distinct names for the mechanisms that happen that are unique to the kidneys. So movement of blood the watery component of blood only. We'll talk about this when we look at the kidneys in more detail, but the cells don't leave the blood. Only the watery component, the plasma, gets filtered into the kidney. That is called filtration. Right? And again, indicating here that not everything is going through, it's semi-permeable, some things will go through and others will not. There's also reabsorption taking place. Okay, so because when we filter the blood, we can sometimes lose important things like glucose and amino acids. We want to be able to reclaim those back into the blood. And so reabsorption is going to help us do that, reclaim the important things that we need in our blood that were accidentally filtered at the first step. And then the last mechanism is going to be secretion. Secretion is helping to eliminate things that were not filtered out, but we still need to eliminate. These will be things like medications we may be taking. This is how they can be detoxified and eliminated through the kidneys. Excess acid in the blood can be eliminated here as well. And so it's really important for our purposes here to describe this in a more general sense, that some things are needed and they can be reclaimed by reabsorption. Other things are not, and they can be secreted by secretion. All right. If we think about dividing the entire body, so here we're looking at the internal body environment only. If we think about further dividing that, we can do so by the fluid compartments. So these fluid compartments are separated by epithelial membranes. Epithelia are the cells that line our skin, our GI tract, our respiratory tract, urinary tract, and they help to create that semi-permeable barrier. Now, if we were to, again, divide this large body of water, it's going to have this entire area that's in blue, that's called our total body water. This is all the water that's in the body. This is going to be water that has dissolved minerals in it. They're going to have certain solutions around cells. And so think about this as being all the water that's in your body, whether it's in your cells or in your vessels or in your tissues. Total body water is all the water that is inside your body. Okay. Now we can further divide that into intracellular fluid versus extracellular fluid. Okay, so thinking back to our schematic here, these are the cells that make up our organs and tissues, bone and muscle, etc. And inside those cells, there is water present as well. If we shift our attention to the blood cells, so the erythrocytes that are inside our blood vessels, they are also cells, so they also have water inside them as well. So all of the water that is in our body, specifically the water that is inside our cells, that makes up the cytoplasm, that can be described as the intracellular fluid compartment. Okay, so intracellular fluid compartment, all the water that is inside the cells. Contrast that to the extracellular fluid compartment. This is going to be all the water that is outside our cells. So we're going to not think about the cells of our organs or the cells of our blood, and we're going to consider ECF, everything outside of the cells. Now that can further be divided into the plasma, and we sort of loosely described plasma before. So plasma is the watery component of the blood, and that's going to surround our cells, versus the interstitial fluid, which is the fluid that is outside of our other cells, okay, cells that are not inside the blood. All right. Any questions so far? Any questions so far? Okay. And if you do have questions in the meantime, please feel free to drop them in the chat, and I'll check here periodically just to make sure everyone's on track. All right. So if we think about the total body water distribution, just to kind of reiterate what we just described, all the water in our body is our total body water. It's usually about 42 liters, okay? All the water inside our cells, okay? That's going to be our intracellular fluid compartment. That's going to be about 28 liters, all right? Now, all the water outside our cells is going to be our extracellular fluid compartment, and that's going to be about 14 liters. All right. Now notice, total body water includes ICF and ECF. Okay. And if you were to add these two numbers, you should get 42. Also notice that plasma and interstitial fluid, or ISF, are included in ECF, excuse me. So the extracellular fluid is further divided into plasma, what is inside the blood vessels that surround the red blood cells, versus what is the interstitial fluid that is around our tissues. Okay. Now, I don't want you to memorize these numbers. It's not really important to do that. What is important is for you to just think about the trend. Think about the general distribution, the fact that total body water includes ICF, and ECF, and then the fact that ECF further includes plasma and then the interstitial fluid. I also do want you to take away that plasma is the smallest component here. It's the least amount of water in our body. That's going to be the water inside our blood vessels that is around our red blood cells. Also important to point out is that these proportions or distributions, these volumes are for an adult male, and they can vary significantly if we think about a child, if we think about an elderly person, if we think about someone who's pregnant or someone who is in a diseased state, if you had kidney failure. These numbers can vary very significantly for pathologic states or for just different ages, right? So this is going to be standard for an adult male.